September this year, Google has released a paper about AI summaries, which is specifically focused on, let's say, multi-website or multi-page summarization. And over here, they give a really perfect example for the problems that are currently appearing on the web. So you can imagine that a person would ask what I should do today in Paris to a kind of, let's say, AI system. And there will be three sources that would say the weather is really bad, you should not go outside, while other sources will start to push their own like commercial intentions, push the products or services, or try to twist these AI summarizers towards doing something that is incorrect or improper. And in this paper, they try to resolve this problem. On the left side, they're showing a kind of standard process for doing this summarization. These are things like RAG and very well-known methodologies within the AI world, and they're very prone to lots of these different problems. On the right side is their invention and this, let's say, new methodology, which from the engineering standpoint is really brilliant because it is able to both find like high effort sources and also filter out the, let's say, low quality. What this is, we will show in a few minutes, but this happens in synergy like all at the same time. They're also protecting the summarizations, or more like they're suppressing, let's say, different attempts to twist or mess with these LLMs in different ways. And here's how it works. Basically, there is a query for which they get the organic set of results, just the basic ones that you can see in any kind of SERP. From there, for each source or for each article, if you will, there happens the actual process of these steps over here. So let's visualize it to make it a little bit more easier to understand. And so we got the query, which brings a list of documents. Here are our, let's say, candidates that should be summarized. The next part that happens over here is they generate claims. Essentially, they need to perform a kind of extraction of atomic claims from these documents. Atomic claims are ultimately triples. You can see an example of it over here in parentheses, which are being extracted from the documents. So over here, we can understand that within a single document, there would be multiple statements that are presented. Let's say, label them something like this. And then, of course, every single document would have lots of different things that it is presenting or it is talking about. So in this scenario, we can imagine it being something like this. And these facts, they're being, let's say, pulled out or extracted as something separate, as a kind of pieces of data belonging to this document over here. And so it will look something like this. From every single document, we pulled all of these factual statements or atomic claims as they are expressing them within this paper. And now we can do certain, let's say, comparison or evaluations over here. Okay, so step one is done. For the next one, they do a kind of decomposition, or more like a, let's say, comparison and evaluation of all of these facts. This is what you can see over here. For all of the, let's say, for the main source and all of its peers or these alternative sources, there comes a comparison of the facts based on these, let's say, parameters over here. For the next part, they do a kind of a calculation, which is essentially comparing all of the results for how many of the facts supported or contradicted each other. And then comes the actual main and final part, where the whole filtering is done, and then the summarization can happen. This is really complex math and very, very advanced procedures or very advanced algorithms mathematically to try to estimate the accuracy of all these things. I'll try to give my best visual representation of how I understand it. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that they need to start evaluating these sources sort of separately, but in relation to every other source. Let's say if we're going to focus on this specific one over here, we have these, let's say, claims or statements, and we will take one of these, let's say, neighbors or alternative sources, and we're going to check, do they agree with this statement or not? Let's say if they agree, we can label it like this. If they disagree, we can label it like this. So this becomes a kind of a procedure to just understand this level of, let's say, agreements or disagreements between two of these sources. Then the same thing happens in relation from, let's say, from this source to the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. Once that is done, the same thing happens going from here to, let's say, the next, and again back over here. An important part is that what they're trying to do over here is they're trying to kind of shape an initial, let's say, number or metric or a score, however you want to call it, that just shows you a kind of indication for these, let's say, consensus parameters. According to the paper, there are different ways to get this, let's say, higher number or a lower number. An important part, and I think a very obvious one, is if you have a complete disagreement across the board, this will give you the lowest possible score because there's clearly something very wrong in terms of, let's say, agreement between these sides. Another part is if you have only agreements, this will also give you the lowest possible score, because this means there's a kind of attempt to, let's say, shape a kind of fake consensus in this way. And so an important moment over here to mention is that once this kind of evaluation or comparison is happening, they are doing what they call within the paper a kind of leave one out, or LOO as an abbreviation. And so what happens is that when we are evaluating this specific source, in my understanding, they take this set of documents over here as a foundation, and then they do a kind of, let's say, reverse mapping or trying to spot things in reverse. This is done in a case or for the reason that, let's say, if this is a kind of a commercially incentivized resource that, let's say, is trying to promote their product, they will have lots of unique statements over here that explain something about their product. But the competitor will not have that, which is why whenever this evaluation happens, it is done based on everyone else on this set, but not the target resource that is being processed. And so this number that they infer by checking the consensus among the resources separately, they use this number in the final formula, which allows them to infer which sources are actually reliable and, let's say, the ones that can be trusted. During this main calculation and the main formula, there are multiple things that are happening within that process. The most important thing that we can see is that there are different types of facts that are being shaped based on this initial, let's say, data sets that have been accumulated. And the first one is the facts that everybody agrees on, which represents a kind of common sense or a generic, let's say, information. So this is very easy to indicate over here. You can see, let's say, all of these sources agreed, and we can mark it like that in the sense that everybody repeats the same thing. In a simpler, let's say, example, you can think that this is saying a kind of London is the capital of Great Britain, which is not that really useful of a piece of information to do a kind of certain calculation during this process, which is why, let me mark it like this. This represents a neutral piece of information. It is not really helping you, but this is also not really hurting you in any way either. The next one is facts that reliable sources agree on, which is what represents value in this case. This is a little bit difficult to represent accurately because this is just a 2D kind of drawing. But let's say for simplicity, if we're going to mark all of these as in, let's say they're agreeing with all these statements, then these facts become a kind of very reliable facts that are coming specifically from these trusted sources. For the accuracy, technically at this level, at this part in the process, these are not yet reliable sources. And this is the, let's say, very tricky and very magical part in a way of this formula, is that initially there is no predefined reliable sources. It all happens as this evaluation takes place. Another simpler way to look at these things, maybe it will give a slightly, let's say, better understanding. If we're just gonna imagine a kind of, over here we have these three sources, and then it's a clear kind of case that they would have a mutual agreement over here, but also overall between them there is a very, let's say, clear indication of some kind of truth, or let's say corroboration of these statements, or consensus, however you want to call it. Then there are facts that contradict these reliable sources, which is a really bad thing to happen. So let's say over here we have a kind of a formed consensus. Let's imagine that it is being followed by this resource over here, and then they create a kind of contradiction for the things that have been stated amongst these sites. This creates a negative impact, or this reduces the final score, which prevents this resource from appearing within these AI overviews. This is an important part to understand, because this is what forms this kind of dynamic or a kind of correcting mechanism within this calculation. So let's imagine this kind of scenario. These sources would they would form a consensus, but then this source would create a contradiction for that. This creates these kinds of, let's say, imbalances. If we want to, let's say, even it out, we can do it in this type of way. There is some agreement over here, but disagreement on this level, and then it is reversed in the opposite way, like this. And now imagine this kind of scenario. Let's say this source creates a contradiction for this strong, let's say, consensus, which negatively affects the chances of appearing in the summaries. But then let's say they have the rest of these statements that create a strong agreement. And so because there is a, let's say, strong overlap on this level, and then there is agreements on this level and over here, this creates, this gives this source a much stronger, let's say, chance to get into the summaries. Another part here is that imagine this will happen. Now the actual, let's say, reliable source, or the main reliable source set, becomes this pack over here, and this one is being completely, let's say, demoted or removed from this, let's say, set of sources that are being summarized. And the final one are the facts that contradict common sense, which is the worst kind of scenario. So let's imagine it, let's say, like this. Let's say if everybody is saying that London is the capital of Great Britain, and you're saying that Rio de Janeiro is the capital of Great Britain, then obviously that there's something really wrong with that resource, and it will face a very severe demotion in terms of calculating this final score. By the way, if you like these kinds of explanations and you want to hear more, go to serp.science and subscribe for the mailing list. This way it will be much easier for me to communicate with you on the very important details. Now, related to this formula and calculation part, in the paper you really can see this most important, let's say, phrase over here. This is a scoring rule, or let's say methodology, that rewards informative agreement. Informative agreement is important part, not anything agreement or the everything agreement. And also it is done this, let's say, beyond a kind of chance or an accident type scenario. So as this calculation takes place, these factors start to, let's say, affect its final score. As the score is being estimated, there is a certain, let's say, ceiling or a threshold that it has to surpass. Once it does that, then it's enough for the system to label it as a reliable source. And then that is essentially allows for the rest of this entire set to be reevaluated based on these specific facts over here. And also I want to show you how this actually performs in the experiments that they have done. They used two different benchmarks over here. Over here you can see different previous methodologies that existed, And this is their performance in terms of percentages, answer accuracy, and different other things. And this is the method that they have invented that is shared throughout this paper. This is one of these tests, and then over here you can see another one. You can make a decision on your own based on looking at these numbers, whether something like this would make sense for them to rely on, or let's say try to apply within the actual search, or whether it does not make sense. And lastly, I want to show the conclusion, specifically the last paragraph in this section. Personally, I found it to be really valuable to understand their vision and sort of direction that they're trying to move towards. So, as they say, in short, the system offers a blueprint for summarization systems that are not just technically robust, but also incentive robust. I really love that they put the word blueprint over here, because I do think it is not the actual system that will be deployed, or at least attempted to be deployed to the real SERPs, specifically to this problem over here. If you remember this full process, there are two pieces when the LLMs are being called. Processing things through LLMs is really expensive, and let's say there are certain problems with that. With the research that is available right now, specifically the research that Corey has done, it's very clear that they have different systems in place to extract the facts without the necessity to rely on these LLMs. And for this kind of thing, I'm not sure, but there could be certain other additional, let's say, variations. This is a really important part. I'll just highlight it for now. We'll come back to it slightly further. But the main point here is that since they call it a blueprint, most likely this exact scenario is not what's going to be deployed within the results, but a more optimized, much more, let's say, cost-efficient model or a principle will be applied. And then they say that by rewarding informative honesty, it reshapes the incentives faced by sources. Next time they tell you to write honest content, you already know what they mean by these things. And this creates a kind of ecosystem where the path to visibility is not gaming the system through uninformative equilibrium or strategic manipulation, but the creation of truthful, high-quality information. So if there is a kind of official communication to write honest or truthful content, well, you understand how they're able to calculate that and understand whether you're being truthful or not truthful. When it comes to this LLM part over here, this is really an interesting piece, and primarily I want to address the part that within the past maybe 6 months, I've observed that lots of feature snippets are being completely replaced with AI overviews. Within the EU, it is a little bit different. Right now, still we can find lots of different feature snippets across different domains, but at least within the US, on these SERPs that I'm tracking, I've seen these major shifts, and there is an interesting part that comes specifically from this situation. This is a little bit more about, let's say, the speculation and this overall direction that can be happening. I might be completely wrong about these things, but since, let's say, the logic of the featured snippets and trying to claim feature snippets and get as many of those as possible, that is bringing a massive benefit for the overall standing of the site. But now, since the feature snippets are being replaced by these summarizers, and then also we can see that there could be a case where there might be necessary steps for them to use LLMs, which increases the costs to create these summaries, plus the summary itself has to be generated. This creates a scenario where, since they have invested a ton of effort into evaluating the precision and accuracy of your content and comparing it against all of those sources, if LLMs are involved in the process of understanding, that becomes really reliable. This is the kind of technology that can truly understand the meanings of text. And if they have invested money into understanding the contents, understanding the facts, evaluating and doing these kinds of comparisons. I do think that at some point in the future, let's say when this is performing at a, let's say, 95% accuracy or preferably even higher, you can see still it's not that close to being perfect. It's sort of just really good in comparison to all the previous things. When it gets to the point of real high accuracy, I do think that this might be a kind of 80-20 signal for the Google themselves, that since a source is being represented across different summaries as one of these reliable sources, that can give a kind of additional signal or additional, let's say, supporting elements for the success on the SERP. As much as I would love to claim this as a kind of a brand new discovery and something that the SEO world has not seen before, this is not true, unfortunately, because a person has been writing about this exact same principle quite some time ago. You can see directly his words over here. Google has published and used a concept of word callouts based on the consensus, which is exactly what's applied in these featured snippets. So, exact same principle, just slightly different, let's say, older methodologies to try to extract these elements. Nonetheless, there still has to be the concept of consensus amongst all of these reliable sources. And then this principle of consensus was discovered and explained. Maybe you can guess if it was like 1 year ago or 2 years ago. It was discovered in 2021. At least this article was written, and this, let's say, piece of information is already mentioned, so it might have been even earlier. The point is that if you want to be calm about your SEO strategies, about some kind of chaotic things happening within the SERPs, try to follow more research-based SEO or something that's closely related to understanding how Google actually works at the fundamental level. It will be protecting you for many years ahead. And I can tell you honestly that most of these principles, they're not really changing that much. As you see over here, it is same principle, just an AI wrapper added to it. Just a slightly different, let's say, approach towards exact same fundamental principle.